Yeah.
Bishop Barron, actually, who you mentioned, Martin, has a really interesting reading. I'm a huge Bob Dylan fan, and he reads like a Rolling Stone, as if once they lose it all, then this is when they actually receive that moment of freedom. It's kind of contrary to the way many people read that song. What do you think of that?
You know, I'm so enjoying this conversation that my mind has temporarily just sort of gone in. And now quietly, that phrase, and make sure you hear my pronunciation, I'm masticating on it.
Yeah,
I'm chewing on it. Say that again, Mark. What were you saying about Bob Dylan?
Yeah, so Robert Barron has a really interesting reading of Dylan's like a Rolling Stone, where he thinks about the character who loses it all. That's actually the moment of their ultimate freedom. It's just what you described made me think of that song and maybe why I like Dylan so much.
Okay, so now you're bringing us, believe it or not, into the epic of the Grail. Now we're cooking. Go get the beer. Now you see, Parsifal only ever, it's very important in our lives that at certain crucial moments we fail to ask very important questions. At a very important moment with the Grail, Parsifal is brought into the presence of the ailing Grail King and is speechless. And the second half of that story is this question of how, by an act of will, do you rediscover something that by an act of grace was offered to you in the first part of your life? And of course, you sort of can't. Grit alone is not going to do it. But in a way, when I hear the Rolling Stones song and I think about, I mean, I don't know what it's like for you men, but in my life, limit is very important. Limit is important. It's the difference between growth and depth. And I think, again, with the tyranny of choice that we're presented with, growth within a mythic understanding of the world is not that you can be anything you want. It's that you're meant to be something quite specific. And the only ground to really pay attention to is that little prayer mat underneath your feet. But for most of us, the trance state of modernity, for me anyway, was so much until a lot got taken away. Until you're on your knees, you're not in the appropriate physical position to look at the universe, I suppose, something like that.
Do you see the Grail story as something related to this longing that we mentioned in terms of Odysseus? Because it seems the Grail is about losing something.
Yeah, you know just as well as I do that the Grail is everywhere and nowhere. Interesting. It's just occurring to me as we're thinking now. We know, don't we, that the Garden of Eden is on a kind of a mountain or a hill. That's right, isn't it? Because it's got the rivers coming out of it. Well, in Wolfram von Eschenbach's version of Parsifal, the Grail Castle is also on a hill. It's called Mount Savage or Wild Mountain. And I think it's absolutely connected with longing. And the interesting thing is when Parsifal, in the second part of his life, is looking to find the Grail, the interesting detail is that to the rest of the world, he still looks like a very successful knight. In other words, he still goes to tournaments, he still wins everything, but by now he's a machine. And at night, it's this longing, it's this Horiath, it's this Nostos that he carries in his chest, that it is only when he meets a holy man who sits down and says, you know what, you've made he says, you've made an art of failure. Ouch. You've made an art of failure. And in this little mossy chapel, Parsifal very quietly, and there's no other way for it, repents. He repents of everyone he's damaged. And I always say when I'm telling that story, that is the moment when something grandiose died and something great was born. And from then on, the trackway back to the Grail opens up. But I think you're right, Jonathan. And I think it's the difference between longing and desire. You know, when I was younger, I knew a lot about longing. I mean, I knew a lot about desire, but as I get older, the strange thing about longing is that sometimes you long for something that in a tangible sense you think you will not receive, but actually there's always a return message. There's a poet called Rumi, And Rumi says, the ache in your heart is the voice of God speaking back to you. So as soon as you are actually open to longing, the return message has already begun by the physical sensation in your chest. I think that's something to do with it.
Do you know about, there's recent Orthodox kind of spiritual idea of keeping your mind in hell. I don't know if you've read about this idea of that we should somehow live in hell, in the sense of Hades, like we should keep our mind in Hades. And and I think it has something to do with longing, something to do with that, which is that in some ways, almost exiling yourself on purpose, almost like exiling yourself from paradise is one of the proper positions in order to, maybe it has something to do with what you're saying, that longing almost has the answer inside it.
Here's a notion, as one artist to another. You must know as well as I do that a lot of great art is made under the conditions of longing. I think of the poet Ted Hughes or Robert Graves. I think of endless poems and stories. To be honest, when I meet people that are absolutely soporifically happy, I find their art dreadful, absolutely dreadful. By and large, what I long for, I'm telling the truth. And we're back to Dylan again, and that's what I admire actually about Robert Barron, because Robert Barron talks about albums by Dylan where he most definitely was not an ostensibly a Christian. He talks about an album called Desire, another album called Street Legal. These are difficult, mystical, knotty things, but I always felt, and forgive me, all my Christian friends disagree, that good art was kind of part of the care package for leaving Eden. We can glimpse it. C.S. Lewis is,
but you've got to. It's there actually in the Bible. You're not making it up, because
tell me, please.
After when Adam and Eve fall, they get chased out of Eden. Then Cain kills Abel, and is chased, let's say, further out into no man's land. And then it says that Cain founded a city, and then Cain's descendants create music. And then it says that from that time, people started calling upon the name of the Lord. And so Cain's descendants create music. They create all the arts, which are actually born out of the fall and out of distance from Eden.
Wow. Now I'll match that in a way with another image from the Odyssey. You will remember that Odysseus, on his way home, he is passing the sirens who sing the music of the smiths, divine music, and he's tied to the mast, and he says, don't everyone else put beeswax in your ears, but I want to have the experience of that primordial divine sound. And he pays the price for hearing eternity. But they say in the story, for the rest of his life, the sound of human music was like a shield thrown on a stone floor for Odysseus.
Interesting. Yeah. And it's interesting that you use that because there's a relationship between artifice and war and weapon making, like a clear relationship, especially in the line of Cain in the story. But what happens actually in scripture, which is interesting in terms of art, is that God covers this fall with glory, is a best way to say it. And so Cain creates the city, creates the arts, creates all of this. And then later, God uses the same arts to create the tabernacle. And the name of the one who made the tabernacle, Bezalel, means something like the darkness of God. And he's called an artificer, which is the only place in the Bible except for Cain's descendants, Tubal-Cain, that is named an artificer. The two only characters in scripture, Tubal-Cain and Bezalel, are called artificers. And so you have this sense in which this distance creates the arts, and then God covers it once it happens. And you can understand, actually, if you want to understand a lot of the actions of God and related to this idea of alienation or of longing, this memory of God from a distance. Think about like Jonah in the belly of the whale, who remembers God in this distance. and then repents, and then God kind of covers that distance. And I think that that has to do with the arts. There's an image of that in the arts. And then that ends with the heavenly Jerusalem as the final kind of uniting of the inside and the outside of the garden and the city. All these things kind of come together in an eschatological vision. But in the story, you see, I think, this kind of distance and covering, which is what makes the arts possible.
Beautiful.
And a lot of Orthodox Christians don't like when I say that, because they like the idea that the arts are just positive, right? That we create beautiful things. But I think that if we see both sides, we have a deeper understanding of why the arts look the way they do.
They do, and I mean, like all of us, there are very degraded forms of expression masquerading as modern art. There are, and at the same time, there is there's phenomenal genius at play all the time. You see it. It rises unbidden, and the artist often barely knows what they're creating. For me, I was tremendously moved by a group of painters after the Second World War. The abstract expressionists came out of New York. You've got Rothko, Pollock, all of that. And at a certain point in my life, I profoundly needed their kind of raging abstraction. And then I find at this age, there are other things going on for me. I want to look at Caravaggio. I want to look at Goya. I want to go back. The world of iconography, Orthodox iconography is now something completely absorbing to me. But it was, I have to say, until Christianity announced itself in me, I couldn't see it. See it, and it's like suddenly going from a meal that you don't care for to a meal that you suddenly realize is filled with nutrition. It's very strange.
Yeah, I agree. It's funny because I'm the visual artist, you're the literary figure, but one of the things that brought me back, I would say, to kind of an insight into Christian understanding was reading Portrait of the Artist by James Joyce. That really shook me because I could see the way he was patterning these images in the story and how he was creating these deep analogies. And the same, even reading Samuel Beckett. I remember in my 20s reading Beckett, The Unnameable, and having this weird intuition about apophaticism, which is like, obviously it's like almost like a reverse apophaticism that he has in that text, but it awoke in me something. Like it definitely woke up something. And there seems to be in modernism, there is a strain of modernism which is a very, very deep looking for meaning, like a very, very deep looking for a purified meaning, both in painting, I think, and in literature. So I think that that's something which a lot of Christians have either, how can I say this, have either integrated too superficially and just imitated. So it's like you have Christian abstract painters, which usually make horrible, not there's nothing of the raw energy that you would see, in a de Kooning, for example. But I think there are ways to kind of integrate these languages into, and I think that the way that you're doing kind of retelling of mythological stories and kind of diving into the grit of the mythological story, I think is a way of taking the best and just kind of pointing it in the right direction.
And so you live in Quebec?
Yeah.
And that's in Canada, isn't it?
Yes, it is in Canada.
I'm coming to Canada in April. I'm going to find you.
Where are you going? Canada's a big place, Martin.
Well, I'm going to tour it over a few weeks. But if you ever fancy doing something on Gawain and the Green Knight, for example,
that would be amazing.
We could tell it and explore it together. Get a few people together. I'd really be up for that. That'd be a marvel.
Yeah, definitely keep me posted. I would definitely love to do that. Okay. Yeah, that story haunts me. The Gawain story haunts me quite a bit. I did a few videos on it, but when I listen to the videos again, I'm like, nah. No, like I get some of it, but some of the twists are so strange that they kind of haunt me.
Well, what our viewers probably don't know, but Mark, of course, knows, is that you and I both had COVID when we were first meant to do that. We got sick at the same time, and I was 6,000 miles away from home, and I entered, having known the story superficially for years. Every time I closed my eyes for that week of COVID, I was plunged quite almost unpleasantly into the story of Gawain and the Green Knight, and have crawled out of the other end of it. And it's all tied up with being sick personally during the thing into a very different understanding. So I'm looking for opportunities to work with others to explore it, especially figures like the Green Knight himself, who from the moment he arrives in Arthur's court announces effectively he's a Christian. He says, I come here under the auspices of the bright mind of Christ. But you look at him and he is this primordial, seething weather pattern of a being, absolutely green. It's not just green armor, it's green skin, it's green hair. The only thing in him that isn't green is his eyes, which are like little lumps of fire or coals, or he's holly. He's the season announcing himself. But then the more you look at the Christian roots of the chivalric code, you begin to understand that the process of Gawain, sorry folks, we've gone off piste here. Gawain just getting to Bertilac's castle, just getting there across the Wirral and the north of England is absolutely an encounter with the underworld itself. He goes to hell to be tested. Then in Bertilac's castle, with the seduction, the attempted seduction of the lady of the place, he's tested through a kind of heaven. He says it. So anyway, the long shot is this is a magnificent, strange story, and I'd love to explore it with you.
Yeah, definitely, because I have tended to want to see I've tended to want to see the moment in the castle as really a part of going through the underworld. And the reason why is because there's like an inversion of, there's like a weird flip of what is happening, where there's, on the one hand, he is now not being, the prowess is Bertilac's prowess in terms of hunting the animals, and he has to avoid the woman. Like he's in his bed, like that's where he's not out fighting, he's not doing the things that knights do, he's in his bed, in his bedroom, and he has to avoid the maiden. And it's like, well, she's not a maiden, he has to avoid the woman. And it's like, what? And then I still, like, when I think about the last moment, when I think about the belt, or I'm not sure what that is. Like, I still don't completely understand what it is that he compromises. Why is it that Bertilac doesn't see it as a compromise? And why does he then see it as a compromise, despite the fact that everybody else, even the husband himself, doesn't see it as compromise? And it's just, I still, like, it haunts me. To be honest, like, it still haunts me.
I've spent all week, I've written about 2,000 words a day, every day now on this story.
It's amazing.
The word that comes up again and again is haunting.
Yeah.
It's the genius of the storyteller that he allows this kind of ambiguity at very important moments to allow this kind of discourse, this midrash, to continue, this kind of associative thinking, because he doesn't crowbar the allegory too near the surface of the thing. So one moment you think you're riding the back of the story, you're riding the back of Gringolet, the next minute you've been whisked off it. But I know for me, of course, as we say, the real failure of Gawain happens in Bertilac's castle. It doesn't happen at the Green Chapel. It's the concealment. It's the concealment. And then Bertilac, of course, shows angelic level of mercy and says, it's no shame to value your life. It's no shame to trying to live. But by then, Gawain's not really having it. And he says, look, I've clearly made I'm going home now, goodbye. And he leaves. He doesn't want to go back to the castle and clink glasses with Morgana Le Fay or anything like that. But it is beautiful when he tells the story to Arthur, leader of men, that they say, okay, once a year we'll wear this sash as as an example, I suppose, of our own frailty, our own humanity. And you know what I'm left with when I had COVID, I kept waking up at night rubbing the back of my neck. And in the dreaming, I was rubbing the mark that the Green Knight had given me to show me my humanity, my befuddlements, my sin.
Mm.
But I know for Gawain, for the rest of Gawain's life. By the way, Gawain's name is Gwal Khmer, it means hawk of May. He's really a bird.
Yeah.
In really early stories, he would have been a hawk. A lot of the Arthurian characters in their early embryonic forms were animals. But I'm interested because then we're into Jacob wrestling with the angel, and then we're into the limp. You know, we're into these things.
Yeah.
Remarks.
Well, for sure, one of the things that happens, what you said, because one of the things I notice in a lot of the storytelling is something like changing death into glory. Like that seems to be something which is a Christian trope, which comes back over and over. But usually, it's not changing death in the sense of a kind of moral compromise. It actually is something like death in the sense of being willing to let go, being willing to die, and being willing to be a victim, or being willing to submit yourself to others, and that becomes your glory. But here in this story, Gawain compromises something, compromises by, like you said, concealing, by not saying, by not giving the belt back to Bertilac. But then Arthur kind of raises it up basically and says, well, we will wear this as a glorious thing every year. And it actually, because it plays on the Order of the Garter, right? Yeah. And these legendary images of the Order of the Garter, where there's a shame that happens. You know, the woman loses her garter, and now there's a moment of shame. And so the king raises it up and says, no, I'm going to wear this as a crown, almost like I'm going to put this out as a glorious thing. But it's like, it's still like, I can't get to the end of it. Just kind of.
It's genius. It's a pebble in the shoe. I told the story on Sunday morning to a group, and people were really upset about the ending. They were really upset. And I mean, a lot of them really enjoyed it, but people privately came to me and said, no, he failed. He failed. And right. It was wrong that Arthur made this good. It was wrong. And of course, as you know, it does mean that Gawain is not really going to be the guy that discovers the Grail.
Right.
Not going to get into the terrain that a Parsifal or a Galahad. He's not going to get into that high vibrational frequency. And I suppose on a very mundane level, he does remind me of, you know, myself and other guys that I know who are, you know, we make mistakes. To be continued anyway. And
yeah, definitely. That would be wonderful.
Amazing. And if I might shift the direction of the conversation just briefly, you don't have to go down this route if you don't wish, but based in part on a conversation I had with Jonathan and Bernardo Castro, one thing I value about both of your works is how you understand that these myths are better psychology than kind of modern psychology, as it were. And I think that's part of why Jung is saying this renewal and why Jordan Peterson is so popular. And I want to ask you, in line with that, what is the kind of the value of myth as psychology, as it were, and the value of these heuristics, kind of unconscious intelligence beyond modern notions of rationalism, which in that conversation I referenced, Bernardo calls it spontaneous intelligence. But this is where the problem came for me. So with someone like Bernardo, there's this emphasis on it coming from below, and it seems to be linked to the will, like a Nietzschean kind of Schopenhauer way of understanding the world, whereas it seems to me from the Christian perspective, and as the to have a complete story, as it were, you would have the above and the below, and it would be more than just individual, like your individual will. It would have to iterate so that we would have to bind ourselves in the community, i.e. the church, and I think that's part of. I don't know enough about John Vervaeke, but I think that's part of where I disagree with his kind of religion notion. It doesn't seem to have that binding quality. Does that make sense? I'll put that to you, Jonathan, first then. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So I think the way to understand it in terms of myth, if you want to have a more secular understanding, is to understand that there are patterns by which the world exists, and these are natural patterns. They're not necessarily scientific patterns, but there are natural patterns by which the world exists, by which things find cohesion, and by which multiplicity expresses itself as well. And so those patterns are causal, right? Again, not in a scientific sense, but in a binding sense. That is, they bind phenomena together in a manner in which we can recognize them as coming together. And those patterns are not, they're not arbitrary. They have a form, they have a structure. And so one of the things that myth is, it's something like those binding patterns, reality binding patterns, joining particular places, particular histories, particular relationships of analogy, and then they appear as stories, they appear as images, they appear as sacred spaces, they appear as common attention. All these things are what actually end up binding reality together. And like I said, they're not arbitrary. You can't bind a community around arbitrary or just random stuff. There's a way in which it happens. So I think that that's what myth is, and that has an objective reality to it. And you can start to see it as you notice the patterns being similar across cultures and across different times. And that culminates into more and more complete versions of the pattern. And I think that ultimately the story of Christ is a culmination of these ancient myths and patterns that appear, and solves some of the patterns. Also appears as questions. It's almost like, what about this? Like, how does this work? There are these questions about, and you see that, in the fall, it's almost like the fall, even in scripture, is something like an enigma. Like, what is multiplicity? What is the situation we're in terms of the fall? What is suffering? What is all these questions? And then the patterns, let's say there are answers that are given, and those answers are binding. Whether the answer is something like sacrifice, you'll have different religious practices, you'll have atonement rituals, you'll have all these types of rituals which are trying to deal with this question, and that ultimately culminates, I think, in the story of Christ. And so I do think that the issue with someone like Bernardo, who I respect very much and I appreciate, is that he wants this kind of simple intelligence at the outset, which isn't conscious, which doesn't have it's almost like a soup of intelligence or something like that. And that these patterns just automatically rise out of this soup and then manifest complexity. But that complexity then comes back and binds down those phenomena. So to me, it's like, why don't you just see those patterns as causal in the first place? And it's almost like I think there's a kind of ignorance of how it actually comes together. If you just see them as emerging out of this kind of simple, boring intelligence, then it's like, well, it seems like it's actually revealing something to you, really, and not just emerging in an almost arbitrary way.
I wonder what you make of that, Martin. Does it make sense the way I framed it there?
Yes, there's a couple of things I'll throw in. One of the things, I suppose, is what I would regard as the essential difference between mythology and psychology, modern psychology. Modern psychology is useful to humans because it tends to reduce something into manageable parts so we can comprehend it. Myth plays a very different move. It doesn't reduce the heat, it amplifies it. It plays it on a symphonic, vast level. So we see it, and we are, because I think most of us really, we're fed usually by images rather than concepts. The sheer radiance of mythology tells me more quicker about an internal situation rather than necessarily turning the heat down to a point in that we get in many traditional kind of therapists' office. So there's amplification with myth, reduction with psychology. I'm not saying psychology should be abandoned for a second. It's just something to be aware of. Now I want to move to your idea of the below and the above, and I want to stay with the image of the Grail, actually, in the story of Parsifal. You will probably you will remember that in the middle of that story, there is a king who has been grievously injured around the groin, which we get all over Western mythology. Now, when Parsifal comes across him, he is fishing alone on a lake at the end of the day. And it's revealed that the only time the Grail King reveals solace from his wound is when he fishes in deep water. And for a period of time, he knows peace. Now, this, in the 12th and 13th century, the time of Wolfram von Eschenbach, this was regarded as problematic for the church because of the lack of the above bit. They were worried that if you followed that associative road, it really meant physician, heal thyself. You know, if you sit there and brood on it long enough, you don't need divine currency. But there's actually another part of the story of Parsifal where, and it's usually on, I think it's on Good Friday, when a dove comes down from heaven with a name, usually the name of the next Grail King on it. But in other words, there is what you would call vertical attention as well as horizontal attention. And you don't create a temenos, you don't create a mundus imaginalis, you don't create a place of sufficient voltage like the cross until you have both. So that would be my thought is, and I feel culturally we're caught mythically we're caught in the myth of Narcissus when I see all the granular angels and demons that live on my smartphone. I see the conversations I'm having with the diabolical and the Luciferic and the angelic all the time on this little machine. And what's happening is I am gazing at my own reflection most of the time. You know, the Greek myth is just getting absolutely hypnotized by the God that is yourself. And that God often neglects to tell you anything you don't like.
Yeah.
I've repeated this a million times, but Joseph Campbell used to say, we all gag on true doctrine. We all gag on true doctrine. So there's just a few thoughts, Mark, on what you were saying.
Thank you so much, Martin, and thank you, Jonathan. I should say too, I don't want to be rude. I really respect Bernardo and appreciate the conversations. It's great to listen in on Jonathan and Bernardo going back and forth. They're both fantastic and provide different emphases, which is important. But I do sympathize with someone like Bernardo too, say non-Christians. So one of the things that he did in that conversation, which I thought was interesting because it seems to be a problem that a lot of people have, was he tried to contrast this unconscious way of understanding the world with the kind of Judeo-Christian notion of God, which I think is a straw man of the Christian God, because he anthropomorphized God in a way that, well, God's not kind of metacognitive, otherwise he'd be a bad guy if he saw reality the way we did. But from what I see in the Christian story, that doesn't seem to be the point. It seems to be that God has this kind of higher intuition, as it were, and is lifting us up again. Does that make sense? So just to give you the background, Martin, and maybe I've misread this, so Jonathan, you can correct me if I misread this, but he had this notion based on, say, the way chess players would not even look at the board, for example, but they would maybe look off into the distance and they would see a kind of number of moves in advance. And contrasted that with a kind of metacognitive, which raises kind of all sorts of problems with the problem of evil. Why would God allow this to happen if he saw it, the past, present, future, in the same way that we do? So I definitely sympathize with that. I just thought that's a mistake that a lot of people have. And again, it seems to, from my reading, like I'm not an artist like yourselves, but from my reading of the scriptures, it seems that there's this emphasis on kind of higher intuition, and the spirit, as you said, Martin, blows wherever it wills and so on. Does that make sense? Or?
Yes. There's nothing I can add to what you gentlemen are already picking up.
But so and so I think so. I think that for sure. I think the traditional way of understanding that there is a kind of higher, like the notion of the nous, even in the human person, is something which is not the same kind of metacognition that we think about when we think of self-consciousness. It's actually a higher intuition, which is in some manners closer to direct experience. And so the way that I think the Greek philosophers, but also the church fathers talked about it, is that you would your experience of self-consciousness would actually be at a lower level, and your higher consciousness, which would be something like the nous, is something more akin to direct intuitive relationship. And so there's no deliberation in direct, in the nous. There's no thinking in the way that we think of deliberating of different parts that kind of argue about what's right and what's wrong. There is just this direct apprehension, you could say. And so I think that would have been maybe useful to bring into the discussion, because I think that's one of the problems with Jung in the first place, is that he just has he has conscious and unconscious, and all of unconsciousness is kind of this dark thing down here. Whereas I think that the more traditional way of understanding it would be there's supraconsciousness. There's a kind of direct capacity to intuit God and intuit the world directly. Then there's something which we could call consciousness, and then there's also these kind of dark undercurrents or unconscious desires and feelings that we have underneath. But I mean, that would have been, I think, a whole other it would have been so I do think that Corbin has an interesting way of understanding that. Like Corbin, although he was a Muslim, right? He has this idea of the imaginal space. He has a 3-tiered universe, and so he has, let's say, direct principles, higher principles, direct apprehension up here. And then he has what's called the imaginal, which is the filtering of that direct intuitive comprehension into the world through imaginal imagery, and then pulling its substance from the lower part, like this kind of lower aspect of the world. And so I think it's something which isn't so developed in Christian thinking, but it might be a way to understand the difference between the unconscious and the superconscious, and how stories come down from above and then pull particularities out of their context, out of this kind of deep well of imagery and idiosyncrasy, let's say.
Yes. Okay, brilliant. Now I have something to say. I'm glad you brought up Henri Corbin. I teach Corbin sometimes, and his really essential essay is called the Mundus Imaginalis, came out in the early 60s. And it's only a few pages, but it's so dense. If you've read it, it takes me about 3 days just to work through the essay. And the really, really important bit, the great Aikido move in Corbin and his Islamic cosmology. And weirdly, he never became a Muslim.
Oh, really? I know that.
He's an
I thought he was a Sufi.
He's an Islamic scholar with lots of Sufic connections, but I'm not sure if he was a Lutheran. There's some odd surprise with Corbin's religious life waiting. Also, if you get bored, look at pictures of put in Henri Corbin as child, and you will see that he was dressed as a girl till he was about 10, which is the tradition of the time. So he's this little sweetie. Anyway, coming back to the Mundus Imaginalis, coming back to what you're getting at, is that for Corbin and Sufism in general, there are realms of information that are positively angelic, realms of imagination that are positively angelic. And that's the reason we go out. That's the reason why Jesus slips out of camp before everybody's woken up, is to be in contact, in vibrational contact with things that are not just entirely domestic. So I would recommend Corbin as a place to go, the Mundus Imaginalis essay, because just to repeat ad infinitum what we've all been saying, until there's a cross involved, nothing much is going to happen. The whole thing is going to be slightly out of balance, and we're just again caught in the adoration of ourselves, something like that.
Martin, if I might ask you about Corbin, there's a guy I used to read. So before I became a Christian, actually a believing Christian, I was really interested in Sufi Islam. And I read Tom Cheatham's book about Corbin, for example. And there seemed to be this notion that I probably believed for a time, that there's this green light which is higher than the light of Christ, as it were. And it's almost suggested that Christ or the Christian faith leads to a kind of nihilism, and that you have to have this green light which is associated with Muhammad to actually discern reality. And then I believed that for a while, but then I sort of discerned that it's a kind of Gnostic thing, and I wonder what you might think about that. And I should say too that anybody who is maybe averse to that idea, I think Vladimir Lossky, the Russian Orthodox theologian, critiques that and corrects it in his book on the Eastern theology or mystical theology of the Eastern Church. Actually,
I know Tom Cheetham quite well, and he's taught on an MA that I co-created years ago. The best book to buy if you really want to get into Henri Corbin and Henri Corbin's great counterweight, which is the fascinating psychologist James Hillman, is a book called Imaginal Love. Imaginal Love, Meanings of Imagination in Henri Corbin and James Hillman. I'm not familiar with what you're describing. I just have a sort of a limited interest, to be honest, because I'm so absorbed in the experience of Christ, which is right in front of me. I just don't have the bandwidth for more fucking theory. I just don't. I'm if you you know what I'm saying.
Yeah.
There's green lights everywhere. There's funnily enough, talking of lights, in Gaelic, there's many different words to describe the fairy, the she, the people of the hill. We are suffused in signs and wonders. This is an incredible world that we live in. But as for that kind of fine tuning, no, I'm not familiar with it. Corbin is really interesting, and Jonathan, you will know this, that Corbin was around Jung's circle. He was around the Eranos conference, which was going on, sort of up and around the Second World War. I was lucky enough to teach with James Hillman before he died. And that was a really, he's a master. I mean, I'm sure Jordan Peterson must have read Hillman. He just must have. And Bly as well, probably, Robert Bly. But I would recommend going into that direction. But funnily enough, I have to say, I know many Islamic scholars, and they say, Corbin's great, but don't get completely chloroformed by it. And on that bombshell.
Excellent, thanks, Martin. And do you have any thoughts on that, Jonathan? Or
I mean, no, I'd never heard what you said about this idea of the green light. I'm not even sure what that means. So I'm afraid I didn't follow exactly what you were referring to in terms of that. So, I mean, like I said, I think like Martin said, in my case, as someone who is just fascinated by stories and patterns and images, I just keep getting completely sideswiped by Jesus's story every day. And I realize I'm constantly seeing things that I've never seen, and I can't believe it. How bottomless is this story? And things that once you've heard, you just can't unhear. And once you realize, you like, wait, this is obviously in the text. But you think, I've been thinking about this for 20 years and I've never seen it. And so, I'll give you a little example. Today, I was talking to someone, a wonderful guy who had just had this amazing insight. And he said, when St. Peter says to Christ, you're not going to die, and then Christ says to him, get behind me, Satan, St. Peter is actually imitating the serpent in the garden. Because the serpent in the garden says to Adam and Eve, if you eat this fruit, you will not die. And Christ says, get behind me, Satan. And Christ's answer is, I will eat the fruit and I will die. And I was like, once you've heard that, once you've seen it, there's no way to unsee it. And I thought, how is it that I'm for 20 years, for like whatever, my whole life, 40 something years, I've been thinking about this story. And I didn't realize, because it's so obvious when you hear it. It's like, why does he say, get behind me, Satan? And it's like, it's right there. He's just quoting straight out of Genesis.
Wow.
And so anyway, so just these little things like that. It seems like this story just doesn't have a limit. It just keeps giving. So anyway, so I'm kind of like Martin, where I just can't get enough of that story. So
I've had a wonderful rollicking ride of 50 years of being around the most phenomenal forms of philosophic thought and spiritual experience and all of it. I've been around, you know, lamas, yoga, I've seen it all has passed by on life's tapas, you know, it's all rolled by. And then suddenly, you know, 2 years ago, I go out in a wood for 101 days, 101 day vigil. And the last thing in the world you expect to see in the center of that experience is Yeshua in an old Devon forest, in an old Dartmoor forest. That world opens up. And for me, it is the moment where the myth world crash bangs into a time and a space, in time and space that we can all, that's historic. And this, you can tell I'm getting animated now. This nonsense, this absolute nonsense that Yeshua is some sort of slightly reformed version of Dionysus. It's utter bollocks. I have to just, as a mythologist and as a Stanford scholar, I have to tell you this. Dionysus is fascinating enough on his own. He really is. Read the Bacchae, look at the whole thing, but you do not get the Sermon on the Mount coming out of Dionysus. He's a very interesting character, and John certainly knew he was communicating to a Greek audience, and there are connections to the divine, but that is it. And any more than that, I don't have a lot of patience for, because it's just bad scholarship. Sorry for my little rant.
Yeah, my intuition about Christ is that he seems to pull in threads in his story. Like his story seems to pull in threads, which you can then see reflected, like myriads of reflection in all these other myths, but he tends to bring them into a character that seems like impossible. And even in terms of story tropes, like in terms of story characters, the way he presents himself, you know, there is no character that is a king and a shepherd and a lover and a victim and a criminal and a philosopher and a teacher. And it's like, how is, and also like a woodworker. What? It's like all these things, all these characters get smashed into one. It's like, how is that possible?
What God wants to be born in a stable with a death sentence on its head the moment it's born? You know, it's
Yeah.
It doesn't make any. It's not a tried and trusted mythological trope. In the world of YouTube, you know, we do receive lots of videos of people saying, well, of course, you only have to look for a second and realize that Jesus is essentially Egyptian, is essentially. Now there are foreshadowings, and I love what you're saying, Jonathan, because as soon as, even with my embryonic understanding of the stories, I suddenly am beginning to realize that the Old Testament is filled, as you're saying, right down at the very beginning, with foreshadowings of things that happen in this very Spartan language of the Gospels. But I just feel it's the difference between transactional myth and transformational myth. And Jesus is transformational. You feel different. You just feel different. You're refreshed in some fashion, you know. So I have to say that.
And Martin, I want to ask, if I may, about your audience. So YouTube is an interesting one. Sorry?
Left of it now. Yes, you know, it's been a hard knock for, you know, wasn't a popular move.
Oh yeah, that makes sense. And I wonder, before then, and maybe even now, was there a major breakdown between male and female, or?
No, predominantly, I'd say predominantly, maybe 80% of the audience over these, or participants and students, have been female.
See, that's what I find interesting, because when you look at YouTube, for example, the audience seems to be heavily skewed towards men, and that seems to be the case. Jordan Peters talks about that, and that seems to be the case for my audience. I'm not sure about Jonathan. I wonder.
Yeah, same. I think it's mostly men in my case too.
Yeah, what does that sort of trend say about the culture, maybe, and what men are kind of yearning for, if we might map it back onto what we were describing before? I think that's part one of my question, as it were. And then if you want to go in this direction also, I'm kind of interested in why maintain these categories of masculine and feminine, which seem to have been in every myth throughout the ages. but have been kind of jettisoned now in a kind of postmodernism. And why do those patterns correspond with our biology in reality, and not just that we're kind of projecting on to the universe, as it were?
I suspect we are getting to the point probably where this is another conversation.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
just-
I'm kind of running out of steam myself.
It's kind of, it's deep and it's rich. One thing I would briefly say is that I had the privilege of working alongside, and I would say under, the great American poet Robert Bly, who really founded the men's movement.
Mm.
It was Robert that wrote Iron John, sold 2 million copies, and in some ways started up an intellectual and spiritual conversation in October 1990 that has led to the ground of lots of things that are happening to this day. And I watched the kind of flack that Bly received in the media was not dissimilar in some ways to some of the things that Jordan Peterson has to endure and go through. But actually, you know, I traveled, you know, shoulder to shoulder with Bly for years, and a man more appreciative of the feminine you couldn't find. You couldn't find it. In fact, what people don't know is that it was women that actually said to him, look, you're great at fairy tales that are filled with the anima. Is there anything you've got for my 14-year-old son who keeps kicking doors and acting ugly in the house? So it's an interesting moment in my own work where, having had a hiatus from the men's thing for about 8 years, I'm beginning to think of what it would be like to have those kind of conversations again, because I have a particular fairy tale. I found a fairy tale called The Two Brothers that's very obscure, but Bly always said to me, he said, if I'd found that one, I never would have bothered with Iron John. Iron John's a good, very good book. So I have interest in it, but I would personally, where this is leading in a conversation, I'd be very happy to talk about it, but I'm probably out of puff this evening.
Yeah.
What about you, Jonathan?
Yeah, I'm kind of reaching the end of my, I think this has been extremely insightful and very provoking, and I kind of need to pull back and think about everything we talked about, because I'm also kind of running out of intellectual steam here.
No, amazing. Thank you so much, gents. And hopefully we can have a further conversation. And of course, you can do something in person. And I'm looking forward to seeing you at the end of the month in person, Martin, too. And Jonathan.
Yeah. And thanks for organizing this, Marcus. It's been great, Martin, to meet you. And
Yeah,
and I feel in some ways I look around the world and I see things kind of crumbling and I get discouraged. But then I also have very deep hope for seeds being planted. And I see that in your work and in Paul and a few other people that are deep storytellers. And I think that these seeds that are planted will maybe not bear fruit in the immediate. We might not see the fruits of some of these things that are being planted, but we're going to see it. I think we're going to see it slowly burgeon. So thanks for everything.
Oh, and yes, and to you, Jonathan, bless you, bless your work, bless your family, your kids, your brother, the whole thing. I just hope you are filled with indecent good opportunities to keep deepening whatever it is you're up to. And Marcus, thank you so much for having us on and allowing this spiritual uproar to occur in your in your little room.
Thank you so much, Martin. God bless you, gents.
I'm going there. Nobody can stop me. Ooh, I'm going there. Don't you want to go too? I'm going there. Nobody can stop me. I'm on my way. I'm going there. I'm going there. Nobody can stop me. Ooh, I'm going there. Don't you want to go too? I'm going there. Nobody can stop me. I'm on my way. I'm going there. I'm going there.